Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Conversations. Before we get going today, I do have a quick announcement from Chris Tower here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Chris Tower, director of the Northwest Voices program here at LCC, where we bring authors from the Northwest to campus for a day of residency. We're now referring it to as the Writers' Day of Residency, because this quarter, for the first time, the authors are doing 3 events, starting with community conversation. The one coming up is in 2 weeks from today. Sasha LaPointe, Coast Salish Indian and punk rock musician who has written a memoir called Red Paint, which just won the Washington Book Award for memoir. She's also a poet and teaches at Tacoma, I want to say Tacoma Community College. I'm not sure. Anyway, that's 2 weeks from today at Community Conversation, followed in this room by a workshop. And then the reading at the Longview Public Library at 5:30. I have some flyers here along with the books that Ian brought to encourage reading about Longview history. And I encourage you to come. We're really excited to bring this author to campus.
Thank you, Chris. All right. So for those of you who are not familiar with me, my name is Courtney Shaw, and I'm the facilitator of the lecture series here. Our theme is Pacific Northwest, and I do want to welcome you to this session, but also remind you that next week we're going to have Ron Holcomb come in. He's going to talk about protecting the environment in the Pacific Northwest. He's an ecologist who has worked on ecological cleanup in the area for years and years and years. And today, I'm very excited. I'm always happy when I get to bring somebody from off campus and somebody new into the Community Conversations fold. So today I welcome Danielle Robbins. Danielle was born and raised in Longview, Washington. She attended R.A. Long High School and Lower Columbia College. Woohoo! Then graduated from Central Washington University in 2006 with a Bachelor's of Arts in History and Museology. How do I not know that word? In 2007 and 08, she lived in Chiang Mai, Thailand, where she was teaching at the Ban San Phan Children's Home. See, this is what I should have done while we were waiting for setup. She taught English, math, geography, PE, and homeroom for roughly 30 children between preschool and grade 6. Upon returning to Longview, Danielle began volunteering at the Cowlitz County Historical Museum, where she was hired as the Education and Public Programs Coordinator in May of 2009. Please welcome Danielle Robbins.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'd like to actually start by saying happy birthday, everyone, because Longview is now officially 100 years old, which is a remarkable thing for a remarkable city. And so that's what I'm going to be talking to you about a little today, is a little bit of our remarkable, beautiful beginnings for Longview. And if you're going to talk about Longview, you have to start with one of my favorite subjects, which is trees. We love our trees around here, but actually the story starts with trees not here, but over in the South. In 1850, a very important man for us was born, Robert Alexander Long. And when he was born, he was not from a particularly rich or particularly poor family, just sort of average American. And when he grew up, he didn't have any great visions about what he wanted to be. He just knew that he wanted to really achieve and put himself out and work hard in his life. And he said that he could really have done just about anything. He started to go into business with a friend, Mr. Bell, and a cousin, Mr. White. And they tried a couple of different ventures. One of their ventures was trying to sell hay. But the year that they tried to sell hay was an especially dry year, and the hay did not grow properly. So that was a complete, absolute bust. When they were trying to sell as much as they could to make back whatever little bit of money they could, they had a cart full of lumber and found out very quickly that the lumber sold better than the hay or anything else. So they thought, okay, let's try lumber. And so they started to sell lumber, and were actually quite proficient at it. Eventually, Mr. White dropped out, and the company that, when it finally got started, became the Long Bell Lumber Company. And by the time that Mr. Long had grown, he just kept increasing his holdings, his companies, many different mills in the South. He even had a few ventures out west by California, by Weed, California. So by World War I, he was a self-made man, basically a Bill Gates of his day, with the the United States' largest lumber mill or lumber empire by the time of World War I. And by that time, he could have retired quite happily, 1918, the war's coming to an end. He's 68 years old, and I don't know about you, but at 68 years old, I would definitely be thinking about retirement, but he was not. That's not the type of man he was. At 68 years old, they were starting to run out of their holdings in the South, and they were, once you don't have timber, where are you going to keep cutting your logs? So he went to his board of directors, many young men who he'd actually brought up in the company, and he worked very hard at fostering a kind of father relationship with many of his workers, that they came in and he basically said, look, you can raise as high as your ability allows. Like those who have ability, you're going to make really good in our company. So he went to these young men and he said, do we liquidate and go out and you guys can try to get jobs in companies that may not be as family friendly oriented, or do we keep going? And when they put it to the board, they voted unanimously to keep going. So now that the vote has been made to unanimously keep going, here in the Kansas City building that Mr. Long built himself for the headquarters of his empire, they said, okay, so where are we going to keep going? And when they looked over the whole country, they discovered that the best timber was here where you and I live. And after much negotiation, they eventually bought some of the best timber that Weyerhaeuser had to offer. Weyerhaeuser had originally bought the timber from the railroads back when the government gave railroads large chunks of land to pay for building the railroads. Weyerhaeuser was one of the companies that had bought a big chunk of this forest land. And so they finally sold off one stand of it to R.I. Long Lumber Company for the intention of building a mill out west, but they needed to know where they were going to build their mill. I love this one just for a point of reference. Logging in the South versus logging in the West. What they were used to versus what we had out here, they would actually fell trees of loggable size for the South. Out here, they'd fell them and let them fall just so that way the big ones, when the big ones fall, it would break their fall. And so the logs of the big trees wouldn't break apart as much. And then they would just leave them there to waste. And that was one of the things that really shocked the Southern lumbermen, is like how wasteful we were out here, because the trees we thought would go on forever. We just had so many big ones. Why bother with the little ones? So yeah, this really, really impressed them. When they came out looking for their lumber, there we go, to buy the stand from Weyerhaeuser, Mr. Long and some of his top executives actually came out to Castle Rock and went out into the woods for a week and traveled their way through the woods for about a week through Castle Rock until they finally came out at one of the little creeks that flows into the Columbia. And by the time that they'd gotten through, they were absolutely sold on the idea that, yes, this was the best timber in the entire world. We have some of the people that went with him. We have S.M. Morris. So Morris would eventually be the guy that's in charge of anything that has to do with the town of Longview. He was the Western manager. So when it came to any question for building Longview itself, he was kind of like the head man there. Jess Andrews, who never actually came out west except to visit occasionally, just like Mr. Long. Mr. Long never lived out here. Jess Andrews was his chief legal advisor and helped him navigate all of the legal problems of what eventually became building an entire city, which was not under what they intended to do in the beginning at all. J.D. Tennant, well, okay, so the gentleman on the log, Mr. I can't pronounce this, Letcher is his first name. I can't pronounce his last name. He's actually part of the real estate division, but he's not like the top dog in the real estate division. I'm not quite sure how he got into this picture, except that he's young and he's looking like he had a lot of fun. So my best guess is he just hitched a ride along for the ride, because he's definitely not one of the top guys. But hey, if the boss is going out to a fun little adventure in the woods, might as well join. So J.D. Tennant, he was in charge of anything that had to do with the mills and the logging and getting the logs from the logging to the mills, which included a logging railroad. And then Bill Ryder, who was the person in the company who'd worked second longest after Mr. Long. So Mr. Long, of course, having started the company, had worked in the company the longest. Mr. Ryder was the second longest employee in the time. He was the timber cruiser. He was the one out here who knew all the best stands and who had found the best timber for Mr. Long. So some of the very important, just a small handful of many very important men who helped build this town, helped build Longview. But where to build their mill? They looked at 8 different sites. They looked at 4 sites down by Astoria. They looked at 3 sites up by Portland. And then there was one site in the middle, which they called the Middle Cowlitz, which was by a little town called Kelso, which only had a population of about 2,000 at the time. And there's a little Cowlitz River there, and the road, which you see, is actually a railroad, not a driving road. Railroads were very important in this. In fact, they at one point thought that they were going to have to build 2 mills, one mill that was going to be deep water port and ship things by water, and one that was going to be the rail port and ship things by rail. One advantage to the Cowlitz site, the Cowlitz County site, was that you had both. You had the ocean-going ships could reach as far up the Columbia River as that far, and there was the railroad. The bottom picture is looking probably from about the cemetery looking towards Kelso. So you can see West Kelso and Kelso proper on the other side of the river, and then just a bunch of farmland. This was a bunch of homestead donation land claim farmers in this area, and that was the valley. It was a swampy, farmy valley, and kind of shows what you got if you weren't in this Kelso proper at the time. Eventually they decided, okay, yes, this is a very good site to build at least one of our mills, start to look into it a little bit more, develop it. Eventually decided that no, they were going to build both their mills here at this site. And the part of the land that they're looking for, I don't think I actually have a pointer that works, is the little chunk of land that where the border on 3 sides, one by the Cowlitz River and then by the Columbia River. So just the little peninsula that sticks out between the Cowlitz and Columbia River of land, which happened to be part of the lowest area in the valley. And that's where they decided to build their mill. Eventually, the mill became the world's largest lumber mill when it was opened. It wasn't opened until 1924, but at the time when it was open, world's largest lumber mill, the West Fir Mill could cut just under 1 million board feet a day. The East Sawmill, which took a little bit longer to build and opened a little bit later, could cut 1.5 million board feet of lumber per day when they opened. So massive mills that could cut massive trees around here. I love that picture of how small she looks compared to the wood that they could cut. If you're going to have the world's largest lumber mill, you're going to have a place for all those workers to work. And at first, the thought was, okay, do we just have a normal mill town? Because that was the typical, you build a mill and then you just let a normal mill town build up around it haphazardly, company store working for the company man, those kind of situations, which is what a lot of their mill sites back south had been. But eventually the idea started to form of something greater, something grander. And it really started with the diking, because the chief engineer for the company, Wesley Vandercook, who is personally my favorite character in the whole building of Longview story, Mr. Vandercook pointed out that, hey, since our mill, which you can see in the top corner, or actually top middle is the mill, since we're in the lowest part of the valley, if you're going to dike us so we don't flood, you'll actually have to like dike all the way or circle around us, and we will become an island of diked land, and all your workers will be outside the island of diked land. And then if it floods, your workers still aren't coming to work because their houses have diked. And he kept pushing for the fact that you're going to have to dike the entire valley. And at first, Mr. Long was very reluctant to this idea, because he actually asked Vandercook, do you think I'm made out of money? Because it was so expensive to buy the entire valley. He actually told Vandercook at one of the meetings, we've rejected your idea, give us your second best. And Vandercook told him, I don't have a second best idea. And then he said that he went through another couple of hours of listening to them, making them listen to his reasons all over again to try to convince them that no, the only proper way to do this is to dike the entire valley. And so this idea starts to form in that, hey, this might be a bigger venture than we originally planned, just to have our mill. The next step to actually Longview becoming Longview was Mr. Long went to a good friend of his, Mr. Kessler. Mr. Kessler was a city planner, had done a lot of work in Kansas City, actually, was quite famous, had won some awards. He invited Mr. Kessler, come out, take a look at this swampy valley, tell me what you think, give me your honest opinion. And Mr. Kessler, when he looked it over, he said, there's a lot of potential here. Like, I know it's a big swampy valley, but you could actually have a city planned from scratch. The last city that was planned from scratch, where they took a field and said, city, here, let's build it, let's plan it, was actually the national capital, Washington, D.C. And Longview is the biggest city since to actually take muddy swampland and say, city, here's the plan first, build it like the plan. So Kessler was the one who really kind of like, along with Vandercook, talking to R. Long, trying to convince him that actually, yeah, you can do something here. You can make a town. Well, Mr. Long was never a man to do things by halves. So when he finally decided that, yes, we will buy the entire valley and dike the entire valley, he realized, okay, we're going to make a town. He said, we're not just going to make any town. We're not just going to make another mill town. We are going to make a model modern city, which is actually really hard to say. Try saying that one 3 times fast. Modern model city. With the idea being that if workers have places like parks to spend time with their family, then they'll be better workers. If they have nice houses that they can be proud to go home to at night, they will be better workers. If they can take pride in their city, then they will be better workers. So it was called the City Beautiful movement. This idea that if you can give workers a place that is not only functional to live, but beautiful to live, then they become the ideal working class because they have something to work for. So the plan came out to draw it all out before they started building. And some of the planners, S. Herbert Hare was one of the major planners, and Kessler, who I will come back to later, but they were some of the ones that were out here chomping through the swampy area and laying out the plans. When they laid out the plans, they were very careful because they wanted it to be so beautiful to have a lot of alleyways, purposely to put all the power lines down the alleyways, so that way the front of the streets could be where the beautiful trees went, which, as we all know, walking around our neighborhoods wasn't so good for the sidewalks. How many of you, just have curiosity, walk down the alleyways because it's easier than walking down the sidewalks around here? That was intentionally done to try and make the place look beautiful, but things that they didn't foresee. Before they start building the town proper, when it was finally decided, okay, we've bought all the land and we've realized that not only are we building the world's largest lumber mill, but we are also going to build a modern model city, Mr. Long called his board of directors together and he asked them to bring their wives. Now, Mr. Long, he was a devoutly religious man, and as usual, he started all his meetings with prayer and reading one of the Psalms. I don't remember which one, but I did look it up. It was one of the shorter Psalms, thank goodness. And then he got into business meeting about like, okay, we're about ready to start this town, building Longview. And he said, okay, for the wives, the reason why I've asked you wives to come to this meeting is because basically, I'm sending your husbands out to do this thing that hasn't been done since the building of Washington, D.C. There's no precedent for this, not really. We don't know. All we do know is that this is going to take a lot of work. This is going to take so much work that you wives will probably not be seeing much of your husbands for the next couple of years. And he told the wives, we all recognize here that a wife can make or break her husband by how much she either supports him or doesn't support him. And so he invited the wives to partner with their husbands in being supportive while they're gone for these long hours, working very hard to build this city. And then he said, also, let us not be governed by selfishness in the work that is before us. And by selfishness, I mean thought alone of making money, but rather to build up a successful business that will do great good. And that was the mandate from day one for building Longview, that they wanted a city that would truly do great good and a company that would truly do great good and add to the world instead of just take away from it. And then they got to work. This picture is at the end of 1922. This picture is actually December 1922, and you can see the skeleton of the Monticello Hotel there in the middle of what was just recently a farm prairie. They had a railroad laying track where, I'm not entirely sure how this machine worked, but basically it would lay the tracks wherever they wanted, and then they would send the railroads out to help build the city because our area is too swampy, too muddy for the cars. The cars just got mired down, or the trucks. So the best way was to put out a spur. You can see one in front of that little house there, do some work, pick up the spur, move it somewhere else, do some work, pick it up, move it somewhere else. And so Longview was actually built by like railroads being the way to get supplies around and men around instead of trucks like what we would use today. The bottom picture is looking out from the front of the Monticello towards what is now downtown. You'll notice that there's a bunch of trees right in the very center of that bottom picture. We're going to jump ahead 1 year later. same trees are now on the left-hand side of the picture. This is literally almost like roughly a year and a couple of months. Let me jump one more time so you can see. Bottom picture, a year later. The house is actually the little one that's almost where the line is on the bottom right-hand picture. I think that's the same house, which was one of the working ones. Today, I don't even think you could get the permits to do what they did back then in the time that they did it. Part of the reason why they were building so quickly is because they had bought far more land than they ever intended to buy. Well, you can't make a profit on the land until you develop it and sell it back, or get businessmen and house owners to come in and start buying the land. So they set like a brutal pace of build it now, build it now, build it now, because the faster you build it, the faster people can come and start buying it back, and we don't go bankrupt, which is always a good thing if you're a business. But where do the workers work while all the houses are being built? Well, a lot of them lived in tents. There was quite a large tent city by the Columbia River. Many of them lived in Skidville. And Skidville, these are boxcars on skids. This is more or less where the post office is today, roughly. And then you lived inside the skid. I believe it was like 2 rooms, back room, bedroom, front room, everything else room with your little stove. My favorite thing to ask the kids when I do the kid version of this presentation is, where are the bathrooms? And then I point out the very, very few little structures between the houses, which I can only assume were the communal porta potties back in the day. That cannot have been fun. Gay Koibeck was one of the 23ers, one of the people that came early on. She wrote later on about, we lived in a tent right on Commerce Avenue. And oh, how it did rain that winter. We had to put buckets all over the bed when rains came down. Talk about pioneering when we think about it now. It was really like whatever shelter you can get over your head while you're building your house. But it was amazing how many people actually came to Longview and looked around and said, yeah, this is going to be tough for a while, but I'm buying into the idea. I want to throw my lot in here with the city and actually have the chance to build something from scratch and help build this modern model town. I told you that one's hard to say. I'm going to start goofing that. Yes, that is part of the circle. Yes, the question is, was that part of the circle? Yes, that's part of the circle. I think that is Washington Way. I would have to double check that one, but I think so. Yes, I believe so. So those who came in 1923 rightly get to call themselves the 23ers. And the 23 Club is, of course, those and descendants of those who came in 1923. A big problem with the town when it was first built, because they were trying to make it as a modern town that would fit a plan, that meant that you had to build the spaces bigger than what you actually needed. So they had huge chunks, great big gaps between here's where people live and here's the stores where you can buy the stuff you need to live, because they hadn't filled in yet. And in the beginning, it was very difficult to not like fudge and let people like live closer to. But the idea was, if we don't stick to this plan, then the plan will just fall apart, and it will all our plans will go to naught, basically. So early Longview was big empty stretches. One stretch that was particularly important to Mr. Long was from the hotel all the way down to the train station on our side of the river, the Longview train station, which is Boulevard or Broadway. Broadway was all the way down. He actually hired people to make all the empty lots basically like garden lots with manicured lawns and little hedges to make them look pretty. So that way, when people got off the train and drove down to the hotel, they wouldn't be seeing emptiness. They would be seeing possibility, was sort of his idea. And yes, the train on our side, Kelso has the right to feel a little bit gypped, because yes, when Longview came in and built the train on their side and was like, no, really, come to our side of the river and it'll be much nicer than going to the Kelso side of the river. But to be fair, it's not entirely Longview's fault, because when they were building their logging railroads, the Northern Pacific Railroad told them that they could not ship logs over the normal railroads because they were too worried about logs falling off and blocking tunnels or something like that. So the railroads actually told the Longview people that, hey, you're going to have to build a railroad to haul your freight, your logs, from where you're logging them up by Riderwood down to the actual mill. So not entirely Longview's fault that the train station. Yes. Yes, the original train station was at the end of Broadway. One other massive feature in our area that was very important to the development was, of course, the lake, Lake Sacagawea. Because we are a big swampy area, there was massive need for fill. The original was Fowler's Slough, which was a bed of the Cowlitz River from way back when that no longer flowed. And when it rained, it could probably be more properly called a lake. And when it didn't rain, it could probably more properly be called marsh. So depending on how much water was in our area, they eventually moved where the lake is. You can see in the map section, the original Fowler's Lake, they're calling it, they're very generous to call it Fowler's Lake at that point, but that's not where the lake is currently today. So they had a whole team of dredges. The dredge that helped build the lake was the Dredge Texas. And that's it in the top left-hand picture, the Dredge Texas, which dug out all of the area, and then everything that was being dug out was used to fill in the lowlands to make them solid enough to build houses. My dad's house is on the old west side, and he said that when he dug down to put a foundation for something, he found a fence post 6 foot down, like the top of a fence post 6 foot down, because that's right on the middle of this dredge pull out from the lake, from digging out the lake. And the tail end of the lake actually got cut off. What used to be Fowler's Slough was cut off because they completely moved where it was. And so another way to see the end that got cut off, there, this picture, you can see the end that cut off. It used to be like when rains came really high, Fowler's Slough would overflow into the Cowlitz as an old bend of the Cowlitz. With the new system, there were not only dredges making the dikes and dredges making the lakes, there were also dredges going through making all of the my mind blanked on the words, all the water sloughs, all of the sloughs that come around and collect. It was made to help drain the valley. Like everything pulls into the lake, and then from the lake it all pulls out into the Cowlitz River as an equalizing table to keep our area drier than what it was when they first got there and saw it. To make it beautiful, it's said, I've heard that they borrowed every single horse in the entire area that they could get their hands on to help them grade everything. All the old farmland had to be torn up and graded up to make it look beautiful. So here's several horse teams grading the lake to help make the lake look beautiful and make it into the beautiful park system that they envisioned, where workers would spend time with their families. The community house being built at the end of the lake eventually became the YMCA. But that was a very important, community was very important. For as small as Longview was in the early days, we had a plethora of civic groups, because if you're coming to a new city where basically a city doesn't exist, so many people discovered really fast that like, we need to be part of groups. We need to have the social interaction and the pulling together and like work together to get things done, and just not be stuck at my house alone, which is cut off from everyone else's house. So many different civic groups started up early on in Longview. It's just a way to socialize. The lake being man-made, when it was first made, it was our swimming pool, which I would love to swim back then. Not so much now, but the Y originally did not come with a pool because the lake was our pool. That's Kessler Elementary in the back of that picture. Yes, Kessler Elementary. As for the walking bridge, originally there were many walking bridges. So apparently, I cannot find a picture in our collection that was the wooden walking bridge, the one that collapsed in 1868. So if anyone has one of those pictures and wants to donate it to the museum's collection, we probably wouldn't say no on that one. This picture here is one of the walking bridges over the lake. The collapse happened in 1968. Just out of curiosity, was anyone there for that night? Okay, cool. A bunch of people, or a couple people from our audience actually were there. And I know at least one gal broke her arm in the bridge collapse. But thankfully by that time, Reynolds Aluminum was up and running, and they donated the aluminum for our new aluminum bridge. There we go. Something else built around the lake, a fixture, was the community church, which was actually the second church they tried to get started. There was one church that I don't remember which denomination it was, tried to get a church started, but kind of had a false start at it. So Mr. Long suggested, why not have a non-denominational community church where everyone can come together, because we're just too small as of yet to have each individual denomination. This seemed to be a rather good idea. And so the community church was built. Mr. Long, I believe, helped pay for about a fourth of it, of the church. The man second from the left is Reverend Gebert, who was the first pastor for like 30 years at Longview Community Church and came to our area. At first, he didn't even necessarily want to come to our area, but a friend of his pointed out that where better for a pastor to go than a place that like has no one and like, you know, has a flock desperately needing and wanting a pastor to lead them. And so he ended up throwing his lot in with us and stuck around. There are a couple of churches that are celebrating 100 years. I know that the Lutheran Church is one of them, and the Community Church is one of them. I would have to look up what the other 2 or 3. Yeah, there's like 2 or 3 churches that are celebrating their 100th year anniversary. I'd have to look up what the other 2 or 3 were. I think it's in here. There we go. For homes built around our area, what we call the Old West Side was originally called just the West Side, but its nickname was Second Mortgage Row, because so many people had to take out second mortgages just to be able to afford a home in what eventually became the Old West Side. Most of the workers, their first home was St. Helens Addition. The St. Helens Inn was actually like 5 inns originally, where most of the single men who came to work were. And then the St. Helens Addition was the first home section for like the common average man working type, was St. Helens Addition. I also believe that before the first schools got going, the first year they actually had classes in one of the St. Helens Inns while they were still building Kessler Elementary. Our city now has very strict zoning and has always had very strict zoning. So whether you love the zoning or hate the zoning, the person you can thank for that either way is Nichols, who Mr. Long's friend, Mr. Nichols, who was the one who, Mr. Nichols never actually came out and helped plan the city, but he believed very much in like, if you're going to make the city beautiful, you're going to have these very strict rules about what can be built where, otherwise things will just become chaotic and you'll end up like with organic growth cities, which are what most cities have, organic growth. So are very strict, like, hey, here's where people are going to live and here's where your businesses are going to be. At the time, Washington State didn't actually have laws that let them put in the zoning laws. So they actually wrote it into the property of each property of here's what it can be used for, to make it. There he is, Mr. Nichols on one side. So we ended up having a street named after him as a thank you for all the work he did for his friend, Mr. Long. He did it free of charge. He never accepted anything. And so Mr. Long eventually decided, okay, let's thank him by naming one of the streets. He actually changed the name of, it was one of the streets with an M name, I think. Was it Missouri? I'd have to look that one up. But so one of the streets, because the streets had names on them, many of them named after different states. And one of the streets with a state name was changed into Nichols Boulevard. And actually, if you go onto that street, you can actually in some corners find the original state street name that was originally going to be in the concrete from when they first built it. George Kessler, on the other hand, Kessler was always Kessler. And the reason why is he was one of the other city planners. So Hare and Kessler, Kessler helped draw it all up, get it all going, and then he passed before the city could actually be built. It's kind of like he was sick for a long time but didn't tell anyone about it, kind of one of those kind of deals. So shortly after his work of building up the plans was finished, he passed. And so right from the beginning, even before all the other streets were getting names, they decided we're going to name one street after Mr. Kessler to thank him for his great work that he never got to see the final result of. Speaking of streets, I'm sure you guys all know that we have some pretty unusual streets around here. The way this started is when they started to pour concrete for the streets, it got pretty expensive pretty quickly. because in our area, they realized it's too wet to have anything but concrete. You can't just have gravel, and our tar streets don't exist back then, so concrete was the only option. They started to pour concrete streets, especially around like Commerce and Broadway, in squares. And so if you go down Commerce and Broadway, you'll still find like the square concrete slabs. But it was so expensive, they were looking for a cheaper way to do it. They actually had an engineer who came in and said, well, you can use it and make it half as thick, take up half as much concrete if you have no right angles. And then you have to let it sit for like 3 weeks. So once they started to get over to like the Old West Side, they started to make these really odd shaped concrete slabs with no right angles that had actually held up amazingly well for being 100 years old. So depending on where in the city you are, you can look around and see, hey, was this a square slab, one of the areas that was built first? Is this a six-sided square slab? That's one of the areas that were built later. This, of course, being one of the streets is being Washington Way, leading us to the Hotel Monticello, once it was finally finished. And I'm sure you guys have all heard the story about on the grand opening day in 1923, which was part of the dedication for Longview. They had their big to-do at the hotel, only the hotel wasn't entirely finished. Mainly the plumbing wasn't entirely finished. So the plumbing went into the basement for the first grand event and then had to be mucked out afterwards so they could finish building the hotel. It was the hotel originally, Hotel Monticello originally, and then when the sign was taken down and fixed, it became Monticello Hotel. The city's first wedding was actually held on the roof of the Monticello Hotel. Oh, and quick note on that one. If you look up Longview's date, like you just, Google it, you'll find out that Longview's official birthday is February 14th, 1924. The reason why we celebrate Longview's birthday as 1923 is because that was the day it was dedicated. Like, the 1923 is like all of us consider, all the locals, we all consider 23 our birthday, when the town was dedicated, when they had their big grand opening ceremonies. But it wasn't until the next year when when the city was put together enough to actually be officially legally incorporated. So that's why the incorporation date is in 1924, but we celebrate our birthday in 1923. The library was a gift to the city from Mr. Long, one of several gifts that he gave, which also right there on that's the dedication day at the library. If you lived in 1923, I think you'd have to really like speeches because there were so many things being opened and dedicated that and every time there was a dedication back then, there were about 5 people giving speeches. So if you didn't like speeches, you're probably in the wrong town back then. A latecomer, our Nutty Narrows Bridge, which wasn't put up into 1963, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. Of course, Amos Peter, who had his offices in actually the plaza that's just right next to where we are. And he was watching squirrels cross from the library over to his plaza where he was feeding them. And then one day, one of them didn't make it across the street. So he took the little squirrel home and showed his kids, who were quite sad that the little squirrel didn't make it across the street. So they had the little squirrel taxidermied. And for years, he kept the taxidermied squirrel in his office. I think the family still owns the taxidermied squirrel, as to my knowledge. But he thought of the idea of, well, let's just make a squirrel bridge for them to get across. And he threw the idea out at a few friends, and all of a sudden it took off. And he actually wrote later on about how once it started to take off, he realized he was actually going to have put some serious thought into it, because his original, let's throw something up there, wasn't going to be good enough once like the whole city was involved. The original base of the squirrel bridge, which you see here, was an old fire hose. They did eventually have to take it down and do some repairs on it. And when they did, in our museum, we actually have a bag of nuts and bolts that the first time I found it in our collection, I was like, why do we have a bag of nuts and bolts? Well, it's from the original squirrel bridge when it was taken down and refurbished many years later. So one of the fun little things we have in our collections. The post office came quite a bit later. The post office was built in 1934. 1930s, definitely. The original post office was in the community center, and the original postmaster was Wesley Vandercook, who was really much too busy being the engineer and figuring out all the engineering for the city to be the true postmaster. So he's one of the only ones at that time who had an official assigned, here, you're the postmaster, but I'm the postmaster in name. postmasters. A fun little story for the post office. It brings up the point that the cheapest thing about Longview was its name. Because when they went to name Longview, Mr. Long was actually not fond of the name Longview originally. He had a farm that was called the Longview Farm back in Kansas, I think. Yeah. And he always believed that like being a man of the land was like the best way to be. So he basically had a mansion farm that was like his ideal, here's how everyone should live. And that was called Longview. So when the idea of naming the town came up and somebody threw out Longview, in fact, I think they might have been meeting at the Longview farm when this meeting was happening. It took a while. Long says that the longer they used the name, the more it grew on him, until finally he was like, stick with this, let's have this name. So then they applied for the name with the post office, only to find out that there was already a Longview, Washington. It already existed. So the company got some of their lawyers to go and check it out, see what the situation was. It turns out that it was a railroad stop for mail bags, where like 3 families in the area, and where the track was, you could see a long way in both directions on a clear day. That's how it got the name Longview. So they went and asked the local families, would they be willing to give up their sign that they were willing to give up their name? And the families were all very agreeable. One of them pointed out, though, it would be really nice if for our little mail stop that we're about ready to rename, if it had like a covered area. So that way, when the mail gets dropped off, our mail bags don't keep getting wet like they've been doing. And we estimate that that would take about $25 to make this mail stop. And Long Bell executives said, no problem whatsoever. Went back and advised that, yes, we should definitely get them their little covered mail stop for $25. And everyone was like, I'm sure secretly jumping for joy inside, because at this point, Longview was costing so much more than they ever initially thought or intended. $25 for a name was like practically a steal. So the original Longview got their mail stop. I forget what they changed their name to, and we got the name Longview, Washington. As for building downtown, the Columbia River Mercantile was, of course, one of the very first buildings to be built, since it was the company store. This is one of the first pictures I can find of building downtown. There's that square concrete I was talking about earlier, which the Columbia River Mercantile was supposed to be the heart of the city. Downtown was supposed to be like the business district of our town. Modern malls certainly did not exist at that time. When the town first got going, one of the other things that Nichols tried to implement, because again, Nichols was all about things looking beautiful. He tried to implement a law that said that signs could not be hanging over the sidewalk more than 1 foot, because he thought it cluttered up the sidewalk and made it look very not nice and not pretty. But that was one of the few places that he got overridden, with the owners on the shops very quickly signing a petition and saying, no, we want to be able to hang our signs out over the street as far as the sidewalk goes. So that was one of the very few places where he actually got overridden, and the signs are now, as you see. My favorite guy in this picture, I don't have a pointer out, it's kind of hard to see. He's on the left-hand side. There's one young gentleman, I peg him at probably like 17, standing next to a car. He's the only person in the whole picture who clearly knows his picture's being taken, because he's like this. What's up? So he's my favorite guy in that whole picture, if you can get a good view of him. Yeah, that's a good question. I kind of look like, we have a blown up version in our office, and it kind of looks like he has newspapers. The next big question is, where was the guy standing to take the picture? Because he had to be on a car roof to be able to get it at that angle. The idea to make the city beautiful, from the hotel to the Monticello, or from the Monticello Hotel to the train station, there it is on the other side. So that way, when guests came in, and even if they came in and saw the big open areas, that this would be the first view that they would see, that they would. So there, a lot of work was gone into making sure that Broadway was always kept up to date, because this was basically your selling point. This was your front of your brochure. Speaking of brochures, there were many brochures that Long Bell put out. They put a huge advertising campaign of like, come to move to Longview, why you should live here. My favorite, they had one that was like 7 points for living in Longview, and like number 3 of the 7 points was that you should come live in Longview because of the weather, because we are at the same latitude of southern France. Not a single word mentioned about precipitation, but boy, do those advertisers earn their buck that day. Here is the train station up close. Beautiful train station when it was first made. Another building also in that area, the Daily News in that area. Fun story about the Daily News with one of the editors, John McClellan Sr. He told an account of one time he stopped at the Monticello Hotel to make a phone call. And while he was in there, I told you about the train tracks and how they laid the train tracks wherever they needed to go. He said he went in there to make a phone call. And by the time he came out, his track had been laid behind his car, and his car was completely blocked in, where it hadn't been there before. Like, they were just that efficient at moving the train tracks. The train station, unfortunately, is no longer around. It's one of the historical buildings of Longview that we've lost because the railroads told Long Bell, you can't shift your logs by our rail. So they were forced to build their own rail. Eventually, they bought out the LP&N, the Longview Pacific Northern Railroad, was bought by the regular rail line. I think it was the flood of 33 damaged the train trestle that went over the Cowlitz River, which basically put an end to the tracks. And not long after that, if you're not going to have people coming over your tracks, then you don't need a train depot. Eventually, a train depot was sold to a hospital, and long story is no longer there. Another building we almost lost was the Columbia Theater. For a while, the Columbia Theater was in danger of being lost, but after we lost the train station, a lot of people actually got together and fundraised to save the Columbia Theater. Thank goodness, because I love the Columbia Theater. I do love this picture taken from the top of the Monticello Hotel, looking down at the Civic Circle where they're having a May Day dance and looking out at the Columbia Theater. But you can see there's one of those train tracks right in the middle of town, helping to build the town. Originally, it was intended for Vandercook and Commerce to be the main thoroughfare of town. But early days, especially 1922, when the plans were being made, cars, again, hadn't taken off yet, or just starting to come into their own. And certainly in our muddy area, the need for cars was not seen as particularly large. So eventually, when people started to figure out that, hey, cars are going to be more important than trains, and we're going to have a lot more and bigger cars than we ever imagined, we need to find a road that we can make into our bigger thoroughfare. And so they looked over and, hey, look, there's that dirt road. 15th was only paved in a little bit of a section. So 15th is a mostly dirt road. And Washington Way, look, there's a dirt road. And it's a lot easier to expand a dirt road than it is to expand an already paved road with buildings built up around it. So that's why our main thoroughfares have all scooted over from the roads that they were originally intended to be, which is a big bummer for Vandercook, who's our guy there on the right. So yes, there he is, Vandercook, my favorite guy in the whole thing. And it's not just because he looks like the old Superman, though that does help. But I really liked his this is the right way to do it. And if you're not going to do it by the right way, then don't do it, or give me permission and I'll do it the right way attitude in pretty much all of building Longview. The other gentleman in this picture, Samuel Mark Morse, who I've already pointed out once, he never got a road named after him. At one point, it was suggested that the town that eventually became Riderwood should be named after him. And that idea lasted until he got back into town and vetoed it. So at the time, he was just not interested in having anything named after him. Eventually, we did name something after him, Mark Morse High School. So show of hands, who's here from Mark Morse High School? Okay. But the first high school in our area, R.A. Long. Who's from R.A. Long? R.A. Long High School. Beautiful school. Was also a gift from the city from Mr. Long to the city. It was actually the last of the very large gifts that he gave. Mr. Long, he gave the library, he gave maintaining the parks, was a huge gift he gave to us. The library was one of the last ones. By the time R.A. Long High School was built, he was starting to run out of funds, and he actually had to take a mortgage on his Kansas City building that I showed you earlier in the presentation. He had to take a second mortgage on that building in order to be able to afford to build the high school. But he promised himself that he was, and so he went ahead and did it. So go R.A. Long. Other schools in the area, there's following the lake down to Kessler, which there's Kessler up close. And at first, this was where everyone went, including all the high schoolers. Other early schools, St. Helens, and I had to throw in Columbia Valley Gardens because that's the school I went to. That was my elementary school, was Columbia Valley Gardens, which they still have the window, but they don't have any of the rest. So yes, I am also born and raised in Longview and so proud to live here in this beautiful plant city where I live and where all of you lived. So I hope that you guys also are as proud to live in Longview, such an amazing city as I am. And thank you so much for having me. Yes, question.
I'm coming around for the questions.
It's my understanding that the library still belongs to the family, the R.A. Long family, that they own that still, and then that you cannot use it for anything but a library. And if you do, then they'll take it back.
Oh,
I don't know.
I had not actually.
You've never heard that?
I had
I-
never heard that, but that we were looking
Anyway,
into.
I forget where I heard it, but it was a while back, but I've always wondered if that was true or not. Anyway, thank you. And I have one other question too. Oh, what about Kelso? When was Kelso formed? Do you know?
Kessler is a
No.
pioneer town, and so Kessler is quite a bit older. In fact, Longview is the baby of the area. All the others are pioneer towns built in the 1800s. Longview is the only one built in the 1900s. Yeah, Kelso. Yes, Kelso was definitely already here.
Speaking of Kelso, why do we have West Kelso?
We have West Kelso because Peter Crawford, who's the founder of Kelso, he was good friends with Seth Catlin, and Peter lived on one side of the river and Seth lived on the other side of the river. And so, hey, we're good friends and I'm platting a town. Will you let me plat part of my town on your side of the river so that way we can grow? And Seth was like, yeah, sure, we're good friends. Go for it.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. It's been so interesting. Our family came in 1926 and opened a dry goods business here locally. And my dad was a bellboy at the Monticello Hotel.
Oh, that's
And
so
one
cool.
of his favorite stories was every morning at 6 o'clock, he would take Ari Long his cup of tea and he would get a dime tip. And he thought he was such a rich guy.
Oh, he probably was at that time. I want to invite all of you to have a free quarterly from the museum. So right here, I brought some free quarterlies. They're on growing up in Longview. So you can each take one of those as a thank you for coming to one of my presentations.
Well, thank you very much for Danielle for giving this wonderful presentation. And thank you to our audience. Please come again next week.
Thank you so much.